Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jordana. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to all the team involved. And thank you all for being here for this week. Talmud and Tractate Brachot, Tractate of Blessings, 4a, playfully examines a strange little turn of phrase that appears in the Bible. In describing the story of the Exodus, the Bible imagines that Moses, at one point, in talking about the Exodus to the Egyptian soothsayers and to Pharaoh, uses the phrase that the Exodus will take place kechatzot, around midnight. It's an odd phrase, the rabbis notice, and since the rabbis love noticing choices that the Bible could make that might be different than maybe an obvious language that it could use, the rabbis ask questions that, secular scholars don't ask. Secular scholars don't ask of texts, why would you use that phrase as opposed to the other? The rabbis see a moment like that as an opportunity to explicate something that might teach us something. The Torah, to the rabbis, of course, is a source of infinite wisdom, and therefore any minute choice that the text might undertake to use must be significant. And in this particular case, the rabbis ask, does Moses not know the exact moment at which the Exodus will take place? Did not God say it will take place at Chatzot, precisely at midnight? Why would Moses hedge on the time? Why would Moses say around midnight rather than at midnight? The rabbis use this moment to say something unbelievable. They say, teach your heart to say, I don't know. Accustom yourself, spiritually and morally, to be a person who hedges a little bit rather than the instinct to speak with absolute conviction all the time. Build a virtue ethics of trying to seek to hedge your convictions, to even admit publicly, even if you are the mouthpiece of God, to admit publicly sometimes that you are a little bit uncertain. The rabbis say this for two reasons. It's a good way to avoid getting entrapped. What if you were certain about something and somebody finds a little piece of information that you didn't know about before? What if, for instance, the rabbis say, the Egyptian soothsayers, who had a pretty good read on time and astrological calendars, had made a slight error. And then when they fixed their calculation, they said, aha, you said it was exactly at midnight, but according to our calculations, you are slightly off. Hedging a little bit is a good way to avoid getting trapped. But I think it suggests a far bigger message than the mere strategic question of how to avoid getting caught in your own web of lies. It's more important for each in our own epistemological humility, a basic posture in the world that even when we feel we are certain about something, even if we feel that we are charged with a divine mission, a person should walk and act in the world as though they are slightly not sure. Teaching your heart to say, I don't know. It's the first thing and the strangest thing I want to say at the outset of an educational program. Is there anything that any of us can say as people, as faculty of the Hartman Institute, about what it means to be a Jew and to be a person after October 7th, to launch a week of learning about this momentous event that doesn't feel a little bit banal? For many of us, it feels as though time divides into two eras, before October 7th and after October 7th. One of the most momentous events in recent Jewish history, and for a people that thinks in millennia, recent actually goes back a long time. I had a fascinating moment actually a few months ago when I met somebody. We had met earlier in the year and had talked about all these plans, and then we got back together again in April. And we said, wow, it feels like we met so long ago. When was that? And we did the math, and it was October 5th. Suddenly it dawned on why it felt that it had been such a long time ago that neither of us could remember. What's an easy way to introduce our learning this week about Israel tomorrow, which is ultimately the place where we want to end this seminar, that would force us to reckon with the impossibility of Israel yesterday and all of the deep anxieties and ambivalences that characterize the Israel of today. As Jordana and Sarah and Adam mentioned, it's no coincidence that this year is the biggest CLP program that we've ever had. The first time when we got frantic emails from Israel saying, close registration, close registration. We can't let any more in. You can feel it actually in the back over there. It's no coincidence that more of you came to Israel this summer amidst this vulnerable moment more than ever before, because if you are here, you're probably searching for something. Maybe wisdom, maybe a little bit of clarity and community. I'm certain that we can offer community here over the course of this week. It's one of the things that we've noticed in the North American Jewish community is this impulse, this instinct that returned in robust and powerful ways that we thought was actually dormant for a long time. When something of magnitude happened in Jewish life, people, regardless of their political persuasion, went to be in community together with other people, sometimes to pray, sometimes to say psalms, sometimes to organize, but oftentimes just to sit a little too uncomfortably close to other people. That we can definitely offer you this week. And our hope is to provide some of that wisdom, some of that clarity to help think through this extraordinary moment in Jewish history. That's one of the things that I hope is what brings you here. But what I ask you to bring with you as well, not what you're looking for, but what you bring into this Beit Midrash, is a little bit of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a prerequisite for serious learning in the Hartman Beit Midrash. If you are the kind of person who is uncomfortable with your own uncertainty, for whatever reason, I invite you to heed the learning of the Talmud. Make it a spiritual and intellectual and moral practice, at least for this week. If you walk away from this week and want to go back to your own certainty, there's nothing we can do about it. But at least for this week, teach your heart a little bit to say, I don't know. So with hopefully open minds and open hearts, this is where I want to start. Many of us have been trying to sort things out since October 7th. And when we look at a question of uncertainty, there feel like there are so many arenas, and I'll speak personally, where truths that I believed and dogmas that I held to, and of course there's a difference between truths and dogmas. Dogmas are things that we maintain a belief in that we oftentimes don't interrogate whether they're true, because it's actually more useful for them to simply guide the order and the mechanism of our lives in ways that would be uncomfortable if we actually probed as to whether they were true. But so many truths and dogmas that felt important to me felt debunked quickly, or even in slow ways after October 7th, and even if not fully debunked, at least presented themselves as ripe for re-examination. I think on a lot of the ones that I'm going to list, I'm not alone on this front. I invite you to identify together with me on any or all of a set of assumptions or beliefs, dogmas, that many liberal Jews in particular held as part of what it meant to be Jewish. I think of liberal Jews as a broad category. It does not describe necessarily who you vote for. It means Jews living within the worldview and the framework of liberalism, who include the values of liberalism as part of our religious political identity, whether you identify as an Orthodox Jew, a Reformed Jew, a conservative Jew, a secular Jew, or none of the above. Here are a few. One big one: the basic belief that has been essential for the thriving of Jewish life over the past 2 generations, that a condition of Jews is one of fundamental safety. Now, a Jew never fully believes that they are safe, but the fundamental belief that we are safe, that the State of Israel project is fundamentally secure, There have always been terror attacks, there have always been incursions, but the magnitude of the assault on October 7th, the fact that for a 24-hour period of time, the defenses in the South had been so eliminated and eroded, the belief now that military experts have that if a northern attack had taken place at the same time as the Hamas attack, it would have actually generated, at least for a week or maybe 3 weeks, a true existential threat to the state of Israel. The belief that we are safe in Israel and that the Jewish people are also basically safe in North America. Those conditions, that basic belief, doesn't mean that we weren't vigilant, doesn't mean that security and safety were not part of the consciousness of both Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews for a long time. But I would argue that for a while in North American Jewish life, liberal Jews have operated under the assumption, the story that we tell here at the Hartman Institute often, that the 20th century brought with us a transformation from a story that the Jewish people had held for a long time, that we went from no homes, miraculously in the 20th century, to a story of 2 homes, not 1 home, but 2 homes at the same period of time. It's extraordinary to watch the seismic implications of October 7th for the feelings of safety and security, not just of Israelis, but also of North American Jews. The anxious conversations taking place in Jewish life in North America today, not that people are really actually packing their suitcases or even necessarily renewing our passports, except for all of you who had to come here, not that that's really happening, but the feeling that we were undergirded by a fundamental sense of safety has indicated to us then rather than thinking that as many of us did, that North American Jews and Israeli Jews were somehow moving apart from one another on a different trajectory, if it happens that as Israelis feel less safe than they ever have, and North American Jews feel as unsafe as they ever have, it turns out that rather than being a divergent story, we have actually been holding each other up in strange, subtle, and hidden ways. One central myth that feels as though it is crashing is the story of this double safety. A second myth that has been crashing for many, particularly liberal Jews with liberal orientations about Israel, is that by and large, Israel's failures to end the occupation, to get to a place of Palestinian statehood and sovereignty, that those failures are by and large Israel's fault. Conversations about Palestinian agency don't find their place quite that often in liberal circles. They are an inconvenient truth. And the corollary to that is a basic belief that however hard and however complicated the current moment feels as relates to the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, a prevailing undercurrent of a belief may be rooted in American optimism and entrepreneurship, is that peace is imminent or at least very possible. I know this is a story that has been important to me in my whole life. I remember feeling animated in 1995, living here through the Rabin assassination, which was a moment, the first moment of major crashing of narratives for me personally. But one of the stories that kept me going was a belief that is sustained by fact that a final status agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians landed on Yitzhak Rabin's desk the morning of the assassination. So if you're a person who believes that peace is possible and maybe even imminent, it inclines you to believe that it's in our hands, it's in our grasp, but for these events or these actions of the evildoers, we're right there. Our job is to merely coax, encourage, or hope for that process to cross over the finish line. That belief has been rattled and maybe even shattered for a great many Jews following October 7th. The third major rupture, especially for North American Jews over the past 8.5 months, has been the basic belief that my allies share my values. Since October 7th, the Hartman North America staff basically opened up a speakers bureau. We may have been in your communities. We responded to virtually every inquiry we received from a synagogue, a JCC, a Hillel, a JCRC, a federation, to come speak to staff or to the board or to participants. And we spoke to thousands and thousands of people. And in those conversations, we don't merely share what we think is going on around us. We oftentimes do a tremendous amount of intake about the kinds of issues that are rattling Jewish communal life. And this is one of the deepest ones. This feeling by many well-meaning liberal Jews that we thought we were in relationships of allyship that were reciprocal and well understood. And as I argued back to a lot of our audiences, many of whom started to say things like, but we showed up for a whole variety of causes, and then people didn't show up for us. And I started to notice this shift of, well, maybe I'm not going to show up the next time. And the pushback I said to them was, you didn't show up purely because it was a reciprocal game. It's not like you didn't care about racial justice, but you were doing it because you wanted something in return. By and large, liberal Jews agree with that. Yeah, that's true, actually. That's part of my values. But why is it that in the relationship, I feel unseen? One big rupture, one big challenge that many of our communities are facing is, what is the nature of our relationships with our partners and those who we thought were our allies when so many of us felt betrayed, or maybe slightly less dangerous of a word, at least lonely. But I think the two biggest ideas, and the ones I want to talk about today, the two biggest challenges, the sense of crashing in North American Jewish life, were two. The first, a belief that was prevalent not only by North American Jews, by Israelis as well, regardless of political orientation, was that Israel had changed Jewish history. When people start using terminology and language of pogrom, which was one of the words that many of us went grasping for, how do I describe the violent events of October 7th in a way that doesn't only use words like terror attack, which doesn't quite capture it, and which evokes something out of Jewish history and Jewish epigenetic memory? The word that works the best is the word pogrom. That's the good news, is we have a word. The bad news is the whole premise of the creation of the State of Israel was in part to end that narrative of Jewish history. In fact, one of the forces, the most significant political forces in shifting the mindset of Eastern and then Western European Jewry to embrace Zionism from the end to the end of the 19th century to the beginning and middle of the 20th century, were pogroms in Eastern Europe. And the more that those pogroms would be reported, most famously the Kishinev pogrom, persuaded so much of world Jewry that this thing called the Jewish problem, which was the Jewish language for the same problem before the Nazis took the term, our own recognition that something just wasn't working about the promises offered by emancipation and enlightenment in Europe, it was not yielding what it was supposed to yield, that the Jewish people were going to have to come up with a different answer to that condition, and that answer increasingly was Zionism. So the notion that we would be returning into that story of Jewish history, a people beleaguered by pogroms, feels like it ends that narrative that has been so essential to the pride and joy of Zionism, that we are no longer living within that cycle, that endless, destructive cycle of Jewish history. And the corollary, of course, to that is that the main thing that Zionism was supposed to change for the Jewish people was not that the Jewish people would be forever safe. Zionists were never that naive about that. It was just that Zionists believed that what would change Jewish history is that, as opposed to the story told in the Passover Haggadah, in every generation they rise up to destroy us, And the Haggadah's answer is, who comes to save us? God, with a bad track record. That's the Haggadah's answer. Zionism's answer was, nope. In every generation, they rise us and destroy us, and we will protect ourselves from those threats. To watch the simple collapse of Israeli defenses on October 7th left many Israelis and many diaspora Jews back in a place of wondering, are we back in that cycle of Jewish history? The second major crash that we're going to talk about today is that the liberal order basically works. That the liberal order basically holds. Consider all of the dimensions of October 7th and the aftermath that feel like erosions in the capacity of liberalism and liberal democracy to maintain well-operating, safe, and secure societies. That's the promise that liberal democracy has tried to offer us, as we're going to explore, in response to fascism, totalitarianism, communism, and so forth. Liberal democracy promises order. Terror fundamentally undermines liberal democracy in two ways. It threatens us, and it always then invites liberal democracies to respond illiberally. We shut down civil liberties, as happened in this country. As critics of Israel will say, you were attacked, you were in a place of moral legitimacy when you were vulnerable, but then your response demonstrates that you actually hold to no liberal values. So liberalism is attacked by terror in two ways, both what they do to us and what they make us do in response. October 7th has led to the rise of ultra-nationalist ideas here in this country, and it's no surprise. If you've told a people that we failed to protect you, the people who will come along to politically exploit that language are those who are going to be unforgiving about what they need to do to keep you safe. There, too, a question of the liberal order is being eroded. But for North American Jews, it's not merely a question of the difficulty of whether the liberal order and liberal democracy will hold in this country. We are watching the strange ways in which October 7th is creating weird threats to the very democratic infrastructure in which North American Jews have thrived for the past 3 and 4 generations. If you consider that middle of the 20th century, the central institutions considered to be the things, the pillars holding up liberal democracy, there were basically 3. Trust by the people in a fair and independent media, check. Trust by the people in a basically bipartisan governmental structure in which the political parties are perceived to be in a good faith argument about core and shared values, so that if I vote Democratic or I vote Republican, I'm participating in a robust public debate between 2 good faith efforts. Check. And the third major institution that we understand as upholding the principles and systems of liberal democracy, especially in America, were and have been for a century the universities. So to watch, following October 7th, the absolute erosion of the capacities of the universities, bastions and bulwarks of the liberal order, completely incapable of articulating some version of either moral clarity or a theory of what it means to protect students, or a logic of how we genuinely differentiate between the kind of speech that we want to protect and the kind of hostile and violent behavior that we are required to prohibit. The failure of that infrastructure to hold following October 7th suggests that terror has further and further consequences on eroding the liberal order itself. I would say for Israelis, there's a whole other shakiness that emerged following October 7th, which was an erosion of confidence in that one central institution of Israeli society that has been thought of as unassailable from public criticism, which is the army. An erosion of confidence is a term in Hebrew. You'll hear that it sounds like a term that was invented entirely in Hebrew. The term is called conceptia. That word is the Hebrew rendering of a conception, which means a theory for how we keep ourselves safe. Netanyahu's strategy to manage Hamas the way that he did, on the hypothesis that they would be incapable of doing anything like the October 7th attack. Both of those create a massive erosion of confidence in the public trust, and worst of all, at least for Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, a massive erosion of confidence in Netanyahu's belief to hold to the one thing that has fueled his political career for 30 years, which is the argument that he alone could protect the state of Israel and its people. So beyond the two major conceptual issues that I want to talk about, the question of Israel changing Jewish history and the liberal order basically working, Israelis too are in the midst of their own turmoil about essential concepts and conceptions of what it has meant to be Israeli. But I want to spend our time in those two, to live back in Jewish history and to realize that the liberal order no longer seems to be working. I want us to recognize the gravity of what happens if both of those wind up being true. Conditions for liberal democracy, especially for North American Jews, have been basically the best conditions under which we have ever lived. The idea that it would collapse and erode and throw us back into a story of Jewish history when Jews were essentially rendered protected if they had good relationships with the central authority, and then vulnerable if they had good relationships with the previous central authority, but now no longer with the new one. That whole story of currying favor is a dramatic and almost catastrophic threat to what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. And the idea for Israelis and for Jews that we would be thrown back into the cycle of Jewish history has existential consequences for the very meaning of Zionism. What does it mean in general when human beings confront a historical experience that makes you question such incredibly important assumptions and commitments, especially the kinds that you consider essential to your identity? Whether or not this is bad for the Jews, what does it feel like as a Jew? What happens when my Jewishness is intertwined with these beliefs and commitments? And now my values, the stories that I've told about myself, are confronting a reality in which they feel hard to sustain. For a while, if you have a source pack in front of you, I'm going to work through it. For a while, I've been chanted in response to that question by the ideas of Leon Festinger, who authored The Theory of Cognitive Dissonance. What Festinger helps us to understand is, and the last paragraph that's here in the first text, is that dissonance, the existence of non-fitting relations among cognitions, this is a man in search of an editor, the existence of, let's put it in English, incompatible ideas. I believed something, and now I've encountered a truth that no longer enables me to believe what I believe, which in some ways is the story of all of our upbringings in one way or another, but oftentimes reaches its most powerful moments when there are actually big catastrophes or big stories. What happens? It's a motivating factor in its own right. By the end of the sentence, he says, cognitive dissonance can be seen as an antecedent condition which leads to activity oriented towards dissonance reduction. In English, that means cognitive dissonance makes us feel bad. So we don't want to feel, we'll do things that make us not feel bad, in the same way that hunger leads to an activity towards hunger reduction. Right? Again, translator. Festinger gives something very powerful. This is actually, it's intuitive, but you learn something by thinking about it. If I do confront this kind of reality, we are not such rational and sentient beings that we're capable of just working our way out of a problem like this. It is uncomfortable. Let's name, as an idea in and of itself, how uncomfortable this moment is. Let's appreciate the emotional register in which it lives for us. Breathe with that for a moment. And then notice that our brains are doing something, which is the quest for the kind of knowledge and clarity that's going to help us escape from it. See, Festinger, though, was limited in that he had only one real theory as to what human beings would do when they would encounter cognitive dissonance. It was a radical theory, but it's actually only one option. Festinger's argument was, when human beings have deeply held beliefs, and they encounter a fact that contradicts that belief, the amazing thing about human beings is that we are more likely to dispute the fact than change our beliefs. This is an incredibly important piece of Torah to understand social media algorithms. Social media algorithms are designed on the basis of this knowledge, which is why if you start clicking on an article that is biased in one direction, the algorithm will feed you more articles that fulfill that bias, because it knows if it feeds you an article that conflicts with that bias and your bias, you will enter into a state of cognitive dissonance, and the thing that you are most likely to do is to exit the app. And if your goal is to monetize access to information, you are simply going to keep feeding people stuff that reduces dissonance. The examples that Festinger gives famously are examples like, how is it that early Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and then he is dead? What are my choices at that moment? The power of the belief is so significant that it will generate the belief that he must still be the Messiah, and therefore the fact that he is dead is no longer true. And you can track this through many religions. Christianity is a great example, but it tracks through many deep convictions resist the presentation of new information. I think it's a powerful idea, and there's a lot there. But more recent years, Rabbi B'nai Lappi expands on this and actually says, no, that's not the only option that we have as people, which is to reject fact in order to sustain our beliefs. Rabbi B'nai Lappi was the founder of a queer yeshiva named Savara in Chicago, an extraordinary teacher of Talmud, has this great kind of TED Talk, but like the Jewish version, called Eli Talks. It just means that fewer people have watched it. Says actually human stories always crash at one point or another. Inevitably, we are going to hit a crash of great meta-narratives at one time or another. And she says, actually, we have three possible responses. She says there are three and only three possible responses to a crash ever. Option one is to deny that a crash has occurred and revert to your master narrative, hanging on for dear life. And people tend to build walls around that old master story to make sure that nothing interferes or threatens it again. That's one option. That's the Festinger option. I'm going to double down on what I believed before. I hear this, by the way, among all those, and this is the only people I can't really listen to after October 7th, are any version of, I told you so, or any version of, everything about October 7th reinforces what I already believed. And I'm sitting there saying, there's counterfactual data. If everything reinforces what you already believed, all you're telling me is that you're unwilling to confront what you already held to be true, and that nothing will ever rattle you from your belief system. It's basically a fundamentalist worldview. Option two would be to accept that your story has crashed, completely rejecting that master story and jumping off into a completely new story. You know who did this in Jewish history after the destruction of the temple? Most people. We like to think that there was a straight continuity between the destruction of the temple and then the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism. It's not true. Rabbinic Judaism, as Rabbi Lappy will talk about, was a minority position of people who figured out how to build something new out of the ashes. Most of the people were like, oh well, I guess that story is over. I guess I'll just be a local. And that's probably the sequence for most of the people in Jewish history who experience a crash. And by the way, that story is available today. For those who might have believed in this project, that story is available. Oh well, whether it's liberal democracy or the project of Zionism. But option 3, which Rabbi Lappy argues as the most powerful and difficult option to pursue, is to accept that the story has crashed, but instead of abandoning the story, you stay in it, reinterpreting it through the lens of the crash, building a new story from the amalgamation of the original story, the crash material, and the reinterpretation. God, that's so compelling and so unbelievably hard. You see all of the easy compulsions that come with option 1 and option 2. To reassert that everything I believed in is still true. Or to argue that, well, I guess I was wrong about everything, so I'll pack it up and go. This idea that I would find a way to stay in it, to assimilate new information, to hold on to as much as I can of what I believed in before with new information and with a mission forward, and to do something different. Great civilizational stories inevitably crash. Part of the reason the liberalism story is creating such a rupture for so many of us in all of the ways that it's showing up, especially in North America itself, is precisely because one of the great things, strengths and weaknesses, about the belief in the liberal order and liberal democracy is its hubris. One of the great assets, and maybe weaknesses, as we'll explore, of the liberal democratic model has been its hubris. Liberal democracy has been cocky since the Enlightenment. It has long believed that it is not merely a different way of thinking about the human condition. It is not merely a different way of organizing political governance, but that it actually is not only the best version, but in some ways the telos of human civilization. It is the end goal. It ends all of this rise and fall of empires and replaces it with a secular ideal, parentheses, sourced from religion. Human beings being created in the image of God came long before Enlightenment thinkers themselves said all humans are intrinsically equal, but who argued that this essentially ends the story of the cycles of history that human beings have had to live with and all of the different models of government that we would have had to deal with, and especially following the Second World War, with all of the collapses and the victories of the West over fascism and communism, produce instinctually, and we are the first generation of people to have lived through the hypothesis, argued famously by Francis Fukuyama, a political theorist and philosopher at Stanford, that the era we are living in is nothing less than the end of history. The term is so ubiquitous that we know it, the end of history. It's worth actually reading what Fukuyama wrote back in 1989. Fukuyama has made a career, magnificent career, on reiterating the thesis of the end of history. Whenever somebody comes along, by the way, there's a whole series of books and essays now called The End of History, right? This is his argument back in 1989 as the Soviet Union was collapsing. In watching the flow of events over the past decade or so, it is hard to avoid the feeling that something very fundamental has happened in world history. This is a big statement. Something fundamental has happened in world history. I'm down in the third paragraph. What's that big thing? The triumph of the West, of the Western idea, is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. Right? In the past decade, unmistakable changes in the intellectual climate of the world's largest communist countries, the beginning of significant reform movements in both. But it's more than just high politics. He talks about the spread of consumerist Western culture, clothing stores in Moscow, Beethoven piped into Japanese department stores, etc. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of government. You know, the big if true, right? Big if true. Fukuyama had reason to argue this point. Again, watching the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was like, we won. Rocky IV, we won. Therefore, it must mean, as winners, that we have dismantled the last remaining countercultural claim to liberal democracy and to the liberal order, and we are now on a pathway, a smooth pathway to a newly ordered world that never in its right mind would turn the clock back to imperialism, to communism, to fascism, to totalitarianism, and to fundamentalism. It would never do it. The Israeli version, which has been suspect for Israelis for a long time, from the minute it was written, but I think pretty still compelling to many North American liberal Jews, was the extraordinary vision laid out by the late Prime Minister Shimon Peres in an address to the United Nations General Assembly on September 28, 1993, right around the time of the Oslo signing, when Peres wrote, "We feel strongly that the time has come for all of us, communities, nations, peoples, families, to finally lay down the last collective wreath on the tombs of the fallen combatants and on the monuments of our beloved. It is the right way to honor their memories and answer the needs of the newly born. We have to lay the foundations of the new Middle East." That was his most famous line, the foundations of a new Middle East. He writes near the end of that page, "We witnessed the end of some wars only to discover that the warriors did not reach their own promised land. Some colonized people gained their independence, but they hardly enjoyed its fruits. The dangers may have been over, but their hopes evaporated. We have learned that the end of war should be the beginning of a new Genesis, which will end belligerency and put an end to psychological prejudices." Middle of the page, he writes, "Mr. President, it wasn't simple to open the locked doors to peace. In the name of God, let them not be closed again, so that peace will be comprehensive, embracing all issues, all countries, all generations." He concludes the whole section by saying, essentially we have to build this, and then extraordinarily, Shimon Peres, the great secular liberal leader of Israel, ends with a quote from Hosea, the prophet Hosea. "Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the trader of grapes, him who sows the seeds in the mountains, shall drop sweet wine, and all of the hills shall melt." The heady visions of peace and the possibility of a new Middle East were essential as part of the same Fukuyamian story of the end of history. We don't have to live in this anymore. Israelis have been deeply skeptical about this always. Israelis always found this hopelessly naive. But I think it has been important for those of us who believe in the liberal order to keep kind of hearkening to the possibility of Peres's new Middle East. Maybe not exactly what it would look like or perfect, but that we were on a journey on the way there, that the liberal order wasn't a reality yet, but a kind of eventual inevitability. To believe in the end of history is to say, well, okay, it's over here, and it's quickly going to be over there. In fact, even among folks who are not exactly leftists in this country, pre-October 7th, much of the conversation around the normalization of Israel's relations with other Middle Eastern countries was a version of Peres's new Middle East optimism. It is actually evolving to be a new Middle East. In a lot of ways, the attack by Hamas reflects a continued push against maybe, if you want to be really hopeful, a last gasp attempt to hold back against that new Middle East. But it's hard to use the phrase last gasp anymore. That phrase, in and of itself, suggests a kind of belief that history is either over or near the finish line. But it's not merely a secular or broader argument about liberal democracy. It's also an essential idea to Zionism. Zionism, as I said, sought to end Jewish history, to transform it in a way that would change the very condition of what it has meant to be a Jew in the world. This was a really important part of the Torah of David Hartman, of blessed memory, the founder of this institution, narrating the story of Zionism, but also arguing for it. Hartman's vision for Zionism was an end of history Zionism. As he writes, the dramatic events of the 20th century altered the traditional interpretation of exile for Jewish self-understanding. Before the advent of Zionism, the Exodus created a model that the change in the Jewish people's condition would only happen through the radical intervention of God. He explains that connects human behavior to sin. So if you change, maybe God will come to help you. But as he writes in the final paragraph on page 6, Zionism represented a transformation of this traditional form of self-understanding. Zionism's fundamental message was, if you wish to change your exilic condition, you must learn how nations emerge and survive. If you wish to return to the land, don't wait for a miracle or a prophet to arise. Build agricultural schools, improve your economic base and your knowledge of banking and finance. Develop the art of self-defense, modern warfare, become experts in military matters. In a word, master whatever it takes to build a viable state. Hartman is describing what has turned out to be a great joke about Zionism, which is, who could imagine in all of the years of Jewish history that the Jewish people would have a world-class army and a subpar educational system? To understand that is to get Zionism in its deep way and to recognize that he's right. Zionism is seeking to transform the very idea of what Judaism's priorities are. Secular Zionism completely demythologized the Jewish people's sense of who they were. It contradicted accepted patterns of thought by asserting that exile was not grounded in sin or observance of the Torah's commandments, but could be the result of a failure to exploit the political, social, economic, and military conditions required for nation building. That's going to be the measure of our people. Are we good at this? By the way, for a different day, Hartman, an Orthodox rabbi, his pluralism, his belief in pluralism, largely stemmed from a sense of gratitude to secular Zionists for building the state of Israel. He argued, you brought something to Judaism that I never would have done on my own. And therefore, I got to find ways to make space in my consciousness for you to be a part of my people. Hartman is talking about a demythologization of Jewish history itself. Now, this is still important to Zionism, that we are Jews with agency. Many Israeli thinkers, especially Yossi Klein Halevi, who you'll hear from tonight, they want us to insist that October 7th doesn't bring us back to the cycles of Jewish history. We are not victims again of pogroms. After all, the one thing that we have that the Kishinev pogrom survivors didn't have is the army capable of fighting back. As Yossi says, the real antidote for Zionists from October 7th is October 8th. No Jew in Jewish history had an October 8th. You could pick up the pieces, but the notion you could actually fight back represents a continued demythologization of the condition of Jewish history and Jewish identity. But we cannot deny that some of this, of what Hartman is arguing, feels like end of history stuff. You can't deny, I couldn't deny this, that I wrote about it the week of October 7th. It's okay for us to use the language of pogrom. Not because I'm convinced I'm permanently a victim, but because we as Jews grasp and we make sense of the world by grasping at language that comes from our history, our tradition, and our epigenetic memory. It's okay for us to translate the world using the frame of reference of our past. It's really important to who we are and what we do. October 7th, I think, has returned us in some ways to that myth. I want to read one Talmudic text with you and then talk a little bit about how we may or may not move out of this. I think the myth the return to history, so to speak, for Jews is best captured by a magnificent short Talmudic text, which we're going to read together on page 7. This text describes a view of history in the Jewish tradition which is totally contrary to the belief of the end of history. It accepts theologically and politically that there is something about fate and powerlessness and that we're kind of stuck in this cycle. The rabbis write in the Talmud, in the tractate of Avodah Zarah, a tractate that talks about biblical idolatry, but is actually a treatise for the rabbis in their own time living in the Roman Empire to talk not about the biblical idolatries of the land of Israel, but about the question of what it lives to be in at their time, modern society, and how to navigate their own identity relative to a hegemonic culture. And part of that is you actually have confrontational conversations with other people who know something about your tradition. And you've got to be able to stand up and articulate what you believe in. Certain philosophers asked the sages in Rome, if it's not your God's will that people should engage in idol worship, why doesn't God destroy idol worship? Your God is powerless. Why doesn't God just eliminate the things that are God's competitors? And this one, the rabbis have a really cute answer. They say, look, if people were only worshiping useless objects, God would, of course, destroy them. But they worship the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. Should God destroy the world because of such fools? Rather, so that's a cute argument, right? God can't destroy God's own world to eliminate idolatry because that would be kind of self-defeating. Rather, the rabbis introduced this phrase, rather, olam kemin hago noheg. The world follows its natural course. And those who sinned will ultimately one day get punished. So that's not a great example to draw something, because I think they're right. That's not a great question. But what if I ask a harder question? Consider the case of a person who stole a volume of wheat and went and planted it in the ground. By right, it's stolen property. God shouldn't allow it to grow. The rabbis say, the world goes along and follows its course, and someday there will be justice. Another matter, consider the case of a person who has sex with the wife of another. By right, she shouldn't become pregnant. God should stop that from happening. The world goes along as it does and follows its course, and the world will wait for ultimate judgment. Reish Lakish uses that example and says, the Holy Blessed One says, it's not bad enough for the wicked that we treat my coin as if it was ownerless. What is God's coin? The seal, the human being created in the image of God. It's bad enough that human beings degrade themselves and act in ways that suggest that they are powerless to control their own urges. But not only do they do that, they trouble me and cause me to sign against its will. In other words, it produces children who I still think are created in my image. Human beings are not merely powerless against the cycle of history, this rabbinic tradition teaches. God in God's self is powerless against the cycles of history. This is the strongest rabbinic argument against the notion that there is ever any such thing as an end of history. It argues theologically against that belief, and it argues politically that one should never naively come to the conclusion that somehow clarity of the end of history is possible. We are, I think the rabbis argue here, in this confusing way, stuck in this cycle. The cycle that we call, weirdly, revolution. Revolution doesn't mean something happens and then the world is permanently changes. Revolution is a circle. Revolution is, there's a rebellion, good things happen, society collapses, revolution again. That has been the large story of human civilization until the hubris of liberal order coming along and Zionism coming along and saying, we want to put an end to that cycle and put an end to that story. There are so many ways in which the narratives of olam kinmin hago noheg, that the world simply operates as it does, feel that they are returning to the Jewish consciousness and Jewish culture, ways in which I hear North American Jews talk about the inevitability of the collapse of the American Jewish project. It's in the water that we are on the verge of returning to pre-modern Jewish conditions where we are basically vulnerable as opposed to feeling basically safe. The appeals to metaphors of catastrophes from the past, even the fact that so many Israelis and so many North American Jews, with the example like I gave about our allies, using the language of existential loneliness, like the biblical phrase which Tal will teach on this week, of a people that dwells apart, involves a kind of channeling of an essential Jewish otherness, which is familiar from the cyclical stories of Jewish history. That is a departure. That is our declaration right now that this was not an end of history moment, but we are back in the end of history. Theologically, I love Olam Kemin Hago Noheg. I love that God is a non-intervening God. That works for me theologically. I choose that more than the intervening God. Politically, however, it feels like a nightmare for the Jewish people's psyche to believe that the world simply goes in these cycles and that we are effectively powerless to control the flow of these civilizations. And the real danger to this is that Fukuyama, ironically, actually had built in the seeds of the problem of his own thesis by saying there are two things that could come along that would really threaten the liberal order, and to his great credit, he names them, although he dismisses them. They're not really going to work. You know those two things are? Religion and nationalism. Good news, bad news. Fukuyama is right. Right? And if the secular liberal ideal thought that what it could do was basically build a system and a worldview that was going to be so powerfully resilient that it was going to be able to flick aside religion and nationalism, it also freed that worldview from having to engage with all of the good that was possible out of religion and nationalism. It freed it, or maybe ignored the fact that maybe a version of a secular liberal order that could integrate the power of religion, that could take nationalism seriously, might be the only means, the only bulwark to fight against the dangerous and toxic versions of religion and nationalism that would actually threaten it. I want to talk about what it means to try to find a way through. What it means to try to get away from the hubris of the end of history while not conceding the end of history. What it means for those of us who believe in the liberal worldview, the liberal order, who believe it's actually essential to the future thriving of this place and to the essential thriving of our communities back home, to live in this moment where we are simultaneously experiencing a crashing of that story, and know that if we allow that crash to continue, we will effectively be complicit with the creation of a new world order that will be far worse for us. The idea I want to talk briefly with you about can be found in the banal version of slow peacemaking. To concede that messianism is not a mere incidental transformation of history, but the acceptance that the world does operate the way that it does, and that the best we can do is simply insert ourselves into that story, grab a little bit of agency, and participate in the processes that move us from one place to the next place. This is as banal and simple Torah as one can imagine, putting one foot in front of the other. Maimonides says extraordinarily about the Messianic age. There's a lot of good things in Maimonides. This might be the best. Don't think that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature is going to change. There's going to be nothing different about the world that God created. Rather, Maimonides says, Olam kemin hago noheg. The world will be as it was created. It will follow the same patterns. Although Isaiah says the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard is going to lie down with the young goat, that's a parable. We're not seeking a massive transformation of the world order, right? What's going to happen is Israel will dwell securely together with those wicked Gentiles who are likened to a wolf and leopard. We're not talking about actually a lion lying down with a lamb. Don't think that that's what this is about. The fundamental commitment to the Jewish pursuit of peace and justice in the world is not praying for a supernatural transformation of the existing world, nor should it be for a secular prayer of an end of history. The process we should engage with is the slow, banal process of building something slowly and constantly. What does it mean for a Jewish people amidst a rupture to enter into the third story that Rabbi Lappy introduced to us before? The acceptance of the core premises of what it meant to be Jewish prior to October 7th and what it meant to be a Zionist. To believe that something has changed in the Jewish condition by Zionism. To believe that something is still essential in the liberal and democratic order to being a Jew. To confront the possibilities that thinking that that alone resolves all of the tensions in front of us is merely a question of hubris, to set that aside and to remind ourselves that the only way that you achieve the goals of a transformation of Zionism or the work of building a liberal democratic project is slowly, constantly, and painfully, not demanding rapid transformation, nor giving up on it when it confronts these kinds of obstacles, requiring us to integrate moments like this, the pain of October 7th, ideologically, confronting beliefs that we hold about the world and demanding of us not just to interrogate whether they were right, and certainly not to reject them outright, but to ask of us, what do I need to do in order to sustain that very world in which I believe is possible on the other end? There is no way for the Jewish people in this moment to go around. There is only through. There's no gain in capitulating to those forces, the illiberal forces, the anti-Zionist forces, who will insist as a result of October 7th that the thing that was held true by liberal Zionism is no longer true. There's no gain in capitulating to those forces, nor is there gain on insisting that there is nothing we can learn in our hubris about our ideas that shouldn't challenge us. Because after all, the extremists and the pessimists on all sides felt vindicated by October 7th. Not challenged, but vindicated. Optimists and moderates dust themselves off and start again. Because if you accept that your worldview is fundamentally wrong, all you do is give fuel to the extremists and the pessimists. I started with a phrase about epistemological humility. Maybe that's a little bit about what this moment demands. Not radical ideological transformation. Not that we say because our narratives have crashed, they offer us no strength and no value. But what they do is that they become the forces that teach our tongues to say at least a little bit of I don't know. I gave you for homework to read a best version of this that I know, which is Sir Isaiah Berlin's Message to the 21st Century. Don't read it now. Message to the 21st Century, which is a commencement address that he gives at, I believe, the University of Toronto in 1994, in which he makes a version of this argument, which says, in response to the horrors of the 20th century, the main lesson is not the big vision for the world is liberal democracy. He says the main lesson of the 20th century is that the one thing that should no longer hold sway over the world is the belief that there is a single solution to complex problems, but that societies must commit themselves to the slow bargaining and balancing of multiple values and multiple commitments. Berlin is asking us to go back to the moment of the crash, to Festinger's experience of the cognitive dissonance and say, I know you're trying to escape it and move forward. He's asking us to dwell in it a little longer, because that process of dwelling in it gives you the possibility of moving on to the other end. I want to conclude with a little bit of something brilliant that I just learned from a colleague of mine, Rabbi Mary Brett Kaplan, who's a chaplain in New York City. I was at a retreat with her recently, a Shavuot retreat, and I was watching her with her kids. She has a little one, a toddler, and the toddler, did something, tripped, fell, bumped a knee, bumped an elbow, etc. And Mary Brett put the kid on her lap and just started asking her child to narrate what had happened. And just interacted, asking questions empathetically about what happened. Within 5 minutes, the kid got bored of telling the story and ran off and kept playing. I want to read you what she wrote to me when I asked her about this. When I was in residency, a member of the pediatric trauma team told me he would try different methods to get a child to explain how they were injured, because the part of the brain that's most active during panic can be quieted by the part of the brain that deals with information. The theory is that gathering information from the child specifically can actually have a positive impact on the child. And even if the child, just throw it out the window. Even if the child can't give full or accurate information, the process of asking and listening has a noticeable positive impact. After learning that, I noticed it all the time in the hospital and with my own children. It can be hard to demonstrate how theories about how different parts of the brain work or interact with each other, but it seems to check with theories about narrative and trauma. There's a study that she references, the title of which is Storytelling Increases Oxytocin and Positive Emotions and Decreases Cortisol and Pain in Hospitalized Children. By the way, humanities people could take a lesson from the titles that scientists use. They just tell you the end, right, in the name of the study. It doesn't demonstrate how the brain works or the long-term impact of how storytelling impacts an experience of crisis. But given how much we build sacredness and ritual around storytelling, it's incredibly powerful that science can measure the positive impact of a story on the human body. One of the moments for us right now is to notice the extent to which we've been living through an unbelievable trauma response, and to notice that when you are screaming, as she argues, it's hard to tell a story. Also, when you're telling a story, it's hard to scream. And maybe this is a moment for us in this Beit Midrash where we make a transition from screaming to storytelling and hopefully emerge whole on the other side. Thank you. Okay. I think we have some time for some questions. Yeah? Okay. Somebody have mics? Oh, Karen has a mic. Go ahead, right here in the front. No, you need a mic. This is an act, using the mic, friends, is an act of compassion for folks in the room. So we're going to use mics.
In the beginning, you checked off a free press, and you need to turn it on. But you need to put, I'll swallow it, okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right. In the beginning, you checked off a free press, and you checked off a society where you had
fair governance, yeah?
Right, government, and they work together. And I question that. At least, I don't know that we have a free press. We have a press, but people tend to listen to whoever they believe.
Yes.
And those people don't tend to
Yes.
give information. And at least in America right now, we certainly don't have a government that works together. So I'm not sure how you check those off.
What I was checking off was we don't have that anymore. Yes.
I thought you were checking them off.
Yes. No, I'm saying that's, if you want to measure the health of American liberal democracy, one of the ways to notice it is that the building blocks of that democracy, the building blocks in that process seem to not be working. We'll go to the other side. Becca?
if you talk about Zionism as a change in Jewish thought moving towards agency in solving problems, how does a Zionist liberal rabbi deal with prayer?
Well, in the way I'm talking about Zionism here, which would say we don't think of ourselves as actually having reached the end of history. It actually invites prayer to become part of the process of agency around our responsibility to build that which we want. Now, prayer works differently for a lot of different people. There are folks who pray because it represents the end point of what I think I can do. So I'm going to stop here and then ask God to do the rest. Prayer might not have to work that way. Prayer might also be a means by which human beings fortify the language that represents our own aspirations of what we want to see in the world, where we imagine, even as we are praying, and there are many, Yitz Greenberg is one of these thinkers who would argue that human beings are in a kind of covenantal relationship with God, especially after the Holocaust, which unites human responsibility with God's responsibility. And for more on that, I would direct you to Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. Karen?
So I want to just pick up with a question where you ended with a narrative as, and you didn't say it this way, but I'll interpret it this way, and you tell if that's wrong, but as a form of actually a different form of liberal democracy, as one contact point of solution. But what if narrative is used, as it is in much of the world, to incite violence? And so therefore, it contributes to the death of that.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile those two elements?
Yeah, I think actually there's no question that these are good rhetorical, philosophical tools can be used for good and they can be used for evil, right? We know that to be the case. Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, makes the argument that one of the weaknesses of liberal societies and liberal cultures is that they have abandoned what she calls the poetry of liberalism. And the two examples she draws on are the kind of indispensability to the rise of American liberalism in the 19th century of the poetry of Walt Whitman, the poetry of liberty, and the indispensability of the rhetoric of Dr. King to the civil rights movement. She argues that it's not like incidental. It's not like, oh, this is why so-and-so is popular. It's that actually rhetoric, poetry, storytelling are actually a big part of those very movements. But that maybe because of the end of history hubris, modern secular liberalism has become more comfortable in technocracy than it has been in what she calls liberal poetry. And so, yeah, no question, totalitarian societies marshal narrative all the time. The question of non-totalitarian societies is not how do we get out of narrative because it's exploited by the bad people. The question is, how do you respond with the kinds of poetic articulations of what we believe in? And that is a huge moral project. It's not, you do not win arguments because your argument is theoretically correct. You win arguments because you actually have the capacity to tell stories that persuade people of the nobility of those arguments. I'm going to put, by the way, go out on my own here and put in a rule. Since there are so many of us here over this week, this is a rule that I'm borrowing from the rabbis program. You don't understand why we have this rule for the rabbis program? The rule for the rabbis program is that you get a limited number of questions in the Beit Midrash over the course of the week, and that you should budget accordingly. So I'm going to say 3, and that way we can ensure that if you don't get your question answered now, you will have another time, and hopefully we can abide by that. Nobody's keeping track. It's the honor system. Are we on this side now? Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
First question, so I'll hold my next 2 for the next session.
That's smart.
Yehuda, thank you very much. There was a 4th domain of lack of trust that I want you to comment on, if you would. And it's our faith-based leaders. Speaking in the name of God, we've heard from some faith leaders justifying October 7th by their faith. We've heard others responding based on their faith that now it's time to go back in and resettle Gaza.
Yeah.
We've had other people saying religion has failed, it needs to be recharged, re-energized on the reform end. And so the variety of which people have spoken in the name of religion or faith has undermined faith itself. And so I would ask you your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's this weird thing that that faith has become thought of as synonymous with conviction. If I believe in something, therefore it represents that I have a sense of certainty. And actually, it actually kind of, in theory, should be the opposite. If I believe in something, it's precisely because I can't fully demonstrate it. So it represents an aspiration to something as opposed to a demonstration of something. So a version of this, Berlin actually writes this in his essay, where he says, "We must weigh and measure, bargain and compromise, and prevent the crushing of one form of life by its rivals. I know only too well this is not a flag under which idealistic and enthusiastic young women and men may wish to march." The problem is that when faith gets thought of as being identical to conviction, it presents an idea in the world that the most compelling vision for what faith leadership looks like is connected to certainty. That's the message that will bring about followers. And we have to notice ourselves, as people who are connected to leaders, what we are also drawn to. It may be that we wish that that's not how faith showed up in the world, but that we are also uncomfortable when we hear from politicians and intellectuals and rabbis and spiritual leaders, and they say some version of, "I don't know." And if you, and I'm not singling you out, but I'm saying if you or I am unwilling to vote for a politician who gets up and says sometimes "I don't know," because we think that that represents lack of preparedness or wishy-washiness, as opposed to understanding that epistemological humility is not actually weaker than certainty. It's actually maybe more courageous in the environment in which we live. If we can't do it ourselves, we're not going to have leaders who model it. So you're right. Right now there is a powerful rise, that's what Fukuyama is talking about, of the wedding of religion and nationalism in a language of certainty that's very popular among extremists. Those folks, thankfully, on the right and the left, are still minority positions. And the only way to respond to it is not by creating fundamentalism of the center, right? Which would be ironic, right? The only way to do it is to continue to modeling and trusting in leadership and in voices which actually don't mirror the behaviors of the extremists, but present a totally radical alternative. In general, whenever somebody says, "Why do rabbis do this?" my answer is almost always because congregants want them to. So if you want something different out of your religious leaders, you have to give them the space and permission to model that very kind of thing. They have to feel as though it's actually the rewarded way of leading religiously and politically. Karen? Oh, over here. Mike's coming to you.
Suggestion that a slow-making process is necessary, one step at a time, is a total contradiction with the values of the world we live in, where everything has to happen very quickly, and there's lots of pressures on us to live in that world. So it strikes me that the future is a very challenging period, trying to bring these two contradictions together.
Heck yeah, it is. And again, it goes to the question of we know that the world moves fast. The question is, do we want to be consumers of content that shape our opinion and our knowledge in ways that reward and incentivize that fast-moving knowledge? Or do we want to be the discerning critical thinkers who resist that form of thinking? I watched my own, for the first month after this war launched, and for the first month of October 7th, I felt my core commitments to these ideas withering, because I was obsessed with following things on Twitter, and I found myself believing a lot of disinformation. And we know that there was so much misinformation and disinformation, and because I was so caught up with the villainy of October 7th, I was willing to believe anything and everything that emerged in that moment. Now, there's a difference between being critical thinkers and being sexual assault deniers, right? We know that that's the outer limit. But we do have to notice that if we don't want a world where, even though the incentives out there are constant, moving quickly, making decisions, breaking things quickly, we want to live in a moral world of serious choices that involve building something slowly, painfully, and deliberately. Again, it's a question, whenever you have a question about the market, you have to ask about yourself as a consumer. And this is going to take a lot of work and social stitching to build kind of commitments by Americans, for instance, to a fabric of liberal democracy that in the short term involves a lot of people losing in order for, in the long term, a lot more winning. Those are no question hard sacrifices, and it represents a kind of countercultural posture. That's what I think learning in a deep way is basically supposed to be about. Who has the mic over here? Yeah.
Just want to pick up on your offhand comment that the extremists are still the minorities. They may be in numbers the minorities, but in terms of their performance, I think they're dominant. And moving along on that, if one of the dominant sides represents the utter human depravity, like just human depravity as we may define it, we've seen, to go back to your revolutionary idea, the proper response being, let's eliminate that depravity. Not let's talk to it or let's talk among ourselves, but the moral choice is to eliminate the depravity. And so I'm a little uncertain how you would, or whether you would agree, or whether it fits into your framework.
There is, however, a difference between eliminating the depravity versus becoming as equal in your convictions about the underlying ideas as the enemies you're trying to defeat. This has been the fundamental challenge for the state of Israel in fighting Hamas, which is the differentiation between the objective of defeating Hamas and only Hamas versus the metastasis of the desire to fight Hamas and to actually fight and eradicate the Palestinian people. That is the core, deep tension at the heart of what it means to fight back. You feel the instinct, right, in the responses of Israeli leaders following October 7th to just do what needed to be done. And the responsibility of the IDF has been to constantly differentiate between the objective of the mission, which from the beginning has been to eradicate Hamas and to bring back the hostages, as opposed to allowing that to leach into something bigger. This is the fundamental problem. As I talked about, this is what terror does to liberal democracies. It makes us so scared that we wind up lashing out in ways that wind up implicating our own very commitment to civil liberties. This is what America dealt with in the decade following 9/11 and the Patriot Act. The instinct to close down on civil liberties, and when you look back at it and you're like, wait, but they are opposed to our civil liberties, and in response, we wind up taking away our own civil liberties. Aaron Barak writes about this most compellingly in 2001 in the Yale Law Review. He writes, "A judge on judging." He's like this incredibly self-aware writing as the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court on how terror undermines democracy. And it does so in two ways. It kills our people, and it also puts all of this pressure on the state to respond to terror in ways that ultimately threaten civil liberties. And he says, like Berlin, my job is not to enshrine the state in a certain way, and it's not to allow terror to get away with it. It has to find a way to fight evil. And evil is the exact word. I have to be willing to name it in order to defeat it. I just can't allow its totalizing objectives to wind up infiltrating and penetrating the very society that I'm trying to protect at the same time. Let me take one last one. Thank you. Thank you, Karen and Becca.
So how do you do what you just stated? Does that count as a question?
It does. Listen, first of all, I'm really not blowing smoke. This is why we're here, right? Like, there's a lot of things people can do in response to a war like this that are actually also helping. A person might say, this is, and they have been happening for 8.5 months, volunteering and philanthropy and supporting soldiers on the front and supporting hostage families. And I think that is all incredible. And on top of that, what you've basically done is you've said, I'm willing to put myself into a pluralistic environment, as Sarah talked about at the beginning, to be in a Beit Midrash where I'm gonna be irritated by this thing that somebody said. I see some of you in the room already, right? And I'm gonna really like something and be irritated that other people don't. That posture in and of itself is one of the foundational, it's like the baby steps of building liberal societies. Because remember, liberal societies are not societies where people disagree. It's where people disagree productively and non-violently. So it actually starts, I think, as a virtue ethics move. What is the habit of the mind and heart that I am committed to in order to be part of that society? And then you start knitting social fiber. So this is what we're going to do this week. Thank you, everybody.